At the very onset, I would like to thank Mr. Andrew Ford, Consul General of Australia in Calcutta, that he's given us the opportunity to come and address us, during these difficult times. I can only imagine that life is not normal for him as well. What with so many of his citizens stuck in this part of the world, and he has successfully repatriated one plane load full of them. And I could only imagine how the remaining people are being dealt with. So with these words, I will begin. Sir, distinguished members and friends, I have great pleasure in extending a warm and hearty welcome to you all to this webinar on how is Australia tackling coronavirus and what will be the likely impact on its relationship with its trading partners. In its fights against COVID-19, Merchant Chambers of Commerce and Industry is organizing webinars on different issues to cope up with the lockdown and the crisis thereof. We are thankful to our distinguished guest, Mr. Andrew Ford, for his kind presence and address today. The post-pandemic world will be a curious one. Not only will the virus usher in behavioral, social, and political modifications at a micro level and trigger indelible domestic changes, it will also impact nation states at a macro level. Economic vulnerabilities will be exposed, and the shifting of geopolitical sands will be accelerated. The level playing fields making the global order susceptible to the rise of middle powers. India and Australia have always had a strong and productive bilateral partnership. Underpinned by trade and investment, the scope of Australia's relationship with India has increased in line with India's rapid economic and strategic growth. In 2017, the Australian government commissioned the India Economic Strategy to identify opportunity for Australian businesses in India. The places India at the forefront of Australia's international partnerships. Target includes lifting India into Australia's top 3 export markets and boosting out Australian investment to India from Australian dollars 10 billion to over 100 billion by 2035. We hope the target of IEs will continue in the post-COVID area. Before I hand over to Mr. Ford, who will throw light on the bilateral trade relation between India and Australia in the post-COVID era, I would like to mention a few talking points here. Sir, I have been myself to Australia and have, I was a state guest, so I could tour the country. I had a lot of exchanges with a lot of people. I'm regularly in touch with the members of parliament from Australia and everything. So I would also request, sir, if you could spare a few minutes and share on what is the new normal in Australia. So like we are all experiencing a new normal in India. So what is the new normal in Australia? How is how is life changing for an average Australian? What is happening at their front? And the second is and I say this with all seriousness, the word China conjures up a lot of conversation everywhere. And I know that China is one of Australia's largest trading partners. So what would change for you post-COVID relationship with China? And what we are eagerly waiting to hear from you is how can India benefit, if we can benefit from any shift in your trading relationships with China. Sir, with these words and not wasting more time, I hand it over to you. Just a request to all the participants. I'm sure Mr. Andrew Ford will allow some questions. I will be moderating these questions. Please put them on the chat group. Please post them on the chat group so that I can call them on a case-to-case basis. We are afraid in this webinar mode, we will not have an opportunity to directly interact with him and ask a question face-to-face. We hope that once the lockdown is lifted and if Mr. Andrew is kind enough to ensure a physical interaction with you people. With these words, I hand it over to you, Andrew Ford.
Thank you very much to you, Vivek Gupta, and to the team at MCCI. So I just wanted to check everyone can hear me okay. It's all fine. Vivek, yes? So I'll continue on. So I spoke to the MCCI in March, and that was one of my last activities, or one of the last business meetings that I went to before we all moved into this lockdown period. I think at that stage we were already becoming aware that COVID-19 might become an issue here as it was in other countries. And so I'm very delighted to speak to this webinar today. I've participated in a couple of webinars, quite a few webinars, as you can imagine, since we've gone into lockdown, but I think this is the first one where I've been the main panelist. So thank you very much for MCCI for asking me back so soon. I'm sure it's not very often that you would have had the same speaker come twice in a very short period of time. I'm going to, as you requested earlier, Vivek, I am going to talk a little bit about the situation in Australia. I didn't want to go over the ground I'd covered last time. I wanted to cover a few different things this time, and then wheel back to some of those questions you mentioned earlier about China. Well, not just about China, actually, more about India. I want to talk about India rather than China, because that's where we are. So first of all, what I'd like to say is I want to talk a little bit about how our respective countries have dealt with this whole COVID-19 situation. So first of all, just briefly, what I'd like to say about India is that clearly the early action by the government and the people's response to that action to this unprecedented national lockdown in a democracy has been extraordinary. And some people in Australia can't believe it when I tell them that here we are in a country of over 1 billion people, and certainly to begin with, everyone was locked down. And so it is rather extraordinary. It has to be the most significant lockdown in history. In Australia's case, we were hit quite early with the coronavirus, and I think that partly reflects our connectivity to China. So cases started to appear quite early in Australia, and there was a period where the numbers were moving up exponentially. We've now, as of today, we have around 6,950 cases and 97 deaths. And what we're seeing is that the initial actions and measures that were implemented during the pandemic in Australia have largely been successful in slowing the growth of the cases domestically, ensuring the national healthcare system has the ability to cope with the cases and surge when required. And there's a number of reasons for this success, and some of them will be familiar because they're similar to what's being done in India. The first thing was travel restrictions. So right back at the beginning of February, travel restrictions from China, travellers from China began. And then when we wind back to the 24th of March, all Australians were told not to travel overseas at all. This was unprecedented. We currently have a travel advice system which rates different countries, and there were some countries that in the past were fine to travel to and some that were not, and lots of in between. But this was a global situation where we were telling Australian travellers not to travel anywhere in the world. Since the 19th of March, only Australians and permanent residents have been allowed to enter the country. And when they do enter, they must quarantine in a hotel, government-provided hotel, government-paid for hotel for 2 weeks. So every traveller entering Australia has to go into a hotel for 2 weeks before being allowed to go out into the community. As Vivek mentioned, we've also been helping Australians return home on facilitated commercial flights. Something like 3,700 Australians have returned from India, and many thousands, more than 10,000 from around the world, have returned to Australia on commercial flights that have been, in many cases, facilitated by the government. There's also, with these travel restrictions, there is some very early discussion about Australia and New Zealand introducing a trans-Tasman COVID-safe travel zone, because both New Zealand and Australia have now got to a point where we've, in the modern terminology, just about flattened the curve, and the number of cases each day is small and traceable. Another big factor in achieving this has been physical distancing and restrictions on public gathering. So people were told to stay home unless they were shopping for food, medical, or work and study. One thing that's different about Australia compared to India is that we have allowed people to go out and exercise. So I've seen lots of photos of my Australian friends going for walks and things. Sometimes that's caused problems, and you might have seen photos of people on Bondi Beach, but they closed the beaches, and so people were only allowed to exercise in their local suburban area. Another thing was when you did go outside, you could only be in a group of 2 people a lot of the time. So if you were out on a walk, it was only 2 people. If you're attending a wedding, there was only 5 people allowed. I watched some close friends get married with only 5 people. A video. Funeral had 10 people. And so these were very strict restrictions. Because we've now flattened the curve, as it were, slowly these restrictions are gradually being removed under a 3-step framework. So just in the next few days, people will be allowed to have gatherings that are a little bit bigger, up to 10 people, weddings, bigger weddings and funerals as well. Another thing that's similar between Australia and India is that Australians have been asked to download a contact tracing app called COVID Safe on their phone. And once this app is fully working, it'll speed up current manual process of finding people who've been in close contact with someone else. So the app will actually trace if you've been near somebody for 15 minutes or more who turns out later to have COVID-19. And this means that people can be contacted quicker if they've been in contact with a positive case person, and reduces the chances of passing on the virus. But this app is still being rolled out in Australia and voluntary, but people are being strongly encouraged to load up onto their phones. Another big factor has been the high levels of testing. So we're up to over 3,200 tests per 100,000 people. So, and there's a lot of testing being done of asymptomatic people as well as part of that. Recognising that there are in this virus, you get everyone from people who get extremely ill to people who show almost no symptoms. Another important thing we've been doing is provision of PPE equipment for health workers, and part of that was trying to source that from overseas as well as in Australia. And again, that's similar to India, something that India has also been doing. I notice India is now a move from being more of an importer towards being a manufacturer. So I think that's a significant factor for India. So as I mentioned, some of the restrictions in Australia are being eased soon in a careful and phased manner, including some reopening of some public spaces, restaurants not yet open, but in the not too distant future there might be restaurants under very strict social distancing, physical distancing requirements. And the government is hoping that if everything continues along the current path and we don't have a second wave of infection, that by maybe July, that life will be almost back to some sort of normality. And then one of the important things, of course, is that provide a boost to the economy. People are able to go out of their homes and engage in other activities. But like many countries, government is facing this dilemma, this between health and the economy, between lives and livelihood. And the early emphasis has been very much on health and lives, but now the government is trying to think about how we can also think about livelihood, and that's a similar issue we have in place. We continue to have controls in place to test more people, trace those with test positive, and respond to local outbreaks when they occur. So we've had a couple of small outbreaks recently in Australia, which are like linked to one workplace, and so they're able to quickly trace all the people who were impacted by that. So I just want to go on and talk a little bit about some of the economic impacts now, and I think it's interesting to you as a business chamber. So clearly the restrictions for COVID-19 are already have had a significant impact across the globe, with a lot of domestic economic activity suspended borders closed to people movement. Interest rates are already low, at zero in many countries. So when the government's looking at how to stimulate the economies in many countries, monetary policy isn't necessarily available. So government spending is obviously going to be an important part of economic recovery. So following this virus containment stage, the strength of the Australian economy's recovery will be assisted by government actions to keep business and employees connected and keep people in their jobs, even their business they work for goes into hibernation. And there remains a considerable uncertainty about the economic implications of the coronavirus for this quarter, the June quarter, as we call it in Australia, and beyond. The economic shock both globally and Australia will be significant, but remains dependent on virus spread and the measures to contain it. In Australia, the government have announced a $320 billion Australian dollar package for the economy, which has their focus on employment. As I mentioned, keeping people connected to their employers, so that consumer spending later provides a stimulus. An important part of this has been something called the job keeper payment, which is a wage subsidy scheme designed to keep people in their job. Under this, around 6 million workers have received fortnightly payment of around $1,500 through their employer. And that means employers can keep these workers on and connected, even if there isn't work to do at the moment. It means that when the economy restarts, these workers can be quickly ready to take up the jobs again. We've also allowed workers to access their superannuation funds. In Australia, we have superannuation compulsory saving for retirement. So workers have been allowed to, under the tax rules, access up to $10,000 Australian of their superannuation. We've also allowed some welfare recipients in Australia to get supplementary payments. The government has also established a new network of air freight service providers and freight forwarders to accelerate the delivery of our agricultural and fisheries exports to some of our key export markets overseas. This is part of our international freight assistance mechanism, ramps up assistance to exporters and helps re-establish global supply chains. An emergency and temporary measure to ensure the flow of agricultural products and to service our existing long-term contracts. And in the first week of operation, we had around 560 Australian businesses register and 55 flights secured to produce around the world. Government is meeting a proportion of these costs, which reduce costs for exporters. But as you know, a lot of the costs of freight and flying has increased in recent times. Also, Australian exporters have got access to special loans under a new capital facility administered by Export Finance Australia. And we also have a small and medium enterprises guarantee scheme supporting lending for SMEs, including sole traders and not-for-profit. And the government is guaranteeing new loans under this amount. There's also recently, just last week, we announced that Indonesia has ratified its comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Australia, and that will commence on the 5th of July. So that's another important aspect of global relationships, is of course free trade agreements. And it's good to know that even in this lockdown time, these negotiations and they're being ratified. And so this will mean that 99% of Australian goods will be able to enter Indonesia duty-free or under significantly improved preferential arrangements. I just want to touch a little bit on international students. Of course, India, as I mentioned the first time I spoke to you, is our second largest source of international students, with something like more than 110,000 Indian students studying in Australia. Very important part of our relationship between our two countries has lots of mutual benefits. And in this difficult environment, the Australian government, along with education providers and states and territories and local governments, are working together to ensure that international students who are in Australia are well supported in this stressful time. Now, first of all, we recognise that not all international students face financial distress, and the majority of them may continue to have sufficient funds either from their families or from other funding networks. But for those who do need help, we've got a range of support measures in place, including emergency relief, a new and extended temporary work opportunity in critical sectors. We're also providing access to important mental health and other welfare and support services, to access to superannuation savings in some cases where applicable, and also protection against eviction from rental accommodation, which is the same as offered to the rest of the society. So protections from landlords putting students out of their accommodation. We also take a flexible approach in relation to student visa conditions, where COVID-19 and other travel restrictions have prevented conditions from being met, such as attendance pass, or having to use online learning. State and territory governments and universities are offering a range of support services to students, including fee deferrals, further studies, or payment. So I was on an earlier webinar where we were talking a bit about education, and as I mentioned in my earlier talk, it is one of our key sectors, and we believe that Australia does offer opportunities for those who are looking to send their children or themselves wanting to study overseas. Australia has often competed with some of the other big markets around the world. So I think because Australia is one of the early countries that is coming out of this coronavirus and moving to a safer environment, we believe that many parents in India might start to see Australia, if they haven't before, as a good alternative to send their sons and daughters. Just want to focus now back a bit more on our relationship with India. So when I spoke to the Chamber a couple of months ago, I did talk a bit about some of our ambitious goals for our economic relationship with India. And I think Vivek's already touched on these a little bit. The economic strategy we have for India, the India economic strategy, which has some very important goals to see India become a top 3 trading partner for Australia by 2035. I touched on some of the key exports that we currently have to India, which are coal, education, gas, gold, copper, and tourism. So pretty much resources and services, key exports for us. And back, if you look at India's key exports to Australia, they also included tourism, petroleum, business services, and railway. So there is great potential, we know, to grow our trade and investment relationship. And if you take the long-term view that the strategy did, look at the next 15 to 20 years, what we would see is that there's no market over that time that offers more opportunity for Australia than India. So that head-turning effect that you talked about earlier, Vivek, about people going to start diversifying to India, well, it's already happened. Has been happening for a while, and it will continue to happen, I believe. Certainly free trade agreements are one great way that governments can do their bit to help facilitate trade. Of course, we don't have such an agreement with India. We did try and negotiate through the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. At this stage, India has decided not to join that, but Australia has very much keeping the door open for India to join at some stage. And we do support that because we think we are supporting India's push to play a bigger role in global supply chains. We think if India did decide to change its mind and join RCEP now, it would certainly send a signal to the world that India is a terrific place to invest, and also the potential to become a global manufacturing hub. So in the absence of a free trade agreement, our India economic strategy looks at how we are to grow our relationship. It maps out regions and sectors where Australian business can focus their effort. And I talked a bit about that last time, our 10 sectors and 10 states approach, with education being the flagship sector, and I've already touched a bit on education. And I think one of the things is many Australian university curriculums were already being offered online, but now more and more are being forced to switch online if they weren't before. And so, in this new world where we're doing a lot more things online, including meetings like today, I think you will see that universities that can also offer their courses online will have some advantages. Of course, there will be things that they will need to think about how they do that, to make sure that the person at the other end of the exam is the person who signed on to it and not somebody else. But there are ways that those can be dealt with. I think technology is certainly moving even more rapidly these days, we all know. Tourism, of course, also is one of those 10 sectors, and I think I know that there's a few people from the tourism sector who will be on this talk, and I think it is tourism is clearly a vexed issue at the moment. Well, at the moment, most of us can't even leave our homes, or maybe some of us are lucky enough to go into our offices, but certainly the idea of being able to travel at the moment is almost impossible. We can't travel between our two countries. We're fortunate if we can even travel to another part of the country we're in for a holiday. So tourism, I think tourism is a sector that's clearly going to face some challenges, but like many sectors, we'll have to rethink how they do business in this new environment. I'm certainly not an expert on that. I'm sure many of the people listening to me today will be already thinking about how their businesses will need to adjust in the new environment. So I just want to re-emphasize something I said when I last spoke, that this consulate that I'm the head of, that I'm the Consul General of, it only opened just over a year ago, March 2019. Our fourth diplomatic post that Australia has opened in India, and that recognises the importance of this part of India to Australia, and also India as a country. It represents an expansion of our footprint into this part of India. It's also a recognition that Kolkata is definitely a gateway to the resource-rich states of India and also to the neighbouring countries. We've had a very strong resource relationship. When I went through some of those key exports, a lot of them were resources, as I mentioned, and quite a lot of them relate to relationships that are in this part of India. And mining has continued on in both our country and I've sat in on a couple of other webinars that have discussed mining is an essential sector and will continue to be a driving force in both of our economies. So, I think that's very important. It will be an important part of, continue to be an important part of my report as we move out of this current situation. So commercial and economic diplomacy has very much been our focus and will continue to be the focus as we move forward for this constantly. Just a couple of final comments before I open up the questions. I guess what I want to say is that at this point of the consulate's life, we were ready very much to expand our reach out into the northeastern states. I had a travel program I was all looking forward to undertaking, which of course all of that has to be put on hold. We're not able to travel around those states at the moment. And that's an important part of Australia's expansion, because we don't have as much stronger links into that part of India, and we would like to do that. I guess another thing is that these last few months, as Vivek said, we've helped some Australians fly out of Calcutta back to Australia a couple of weeks ago, and that was very rewarding. Our mission in Delhi, and really across all of our missions across the world, our posts have been very focused on helping Australians who've been trying to return home at this time. And this is a new focus. I mean, certainly in the past, there's been times where we've been trying to help Australians who would get into difficulty in their country, they're travelling or visiting or living. But really only in these sort of crisis situations where we've been called on to help a lot of Australians return. So we've been doing this over the last few months. There's what we've discovered, not surprisingly, is that most people who have been in India at this time and who want to return home are in the north part of India. So we've only had the one flight so far out of Calcutta, and at this stage, it's not looking like we'll get another one for the time being because the numbers in this part of India are low. And so what that says for me is that it's early in our time as a consulate. We do have work to do to build people-to-people links, and part of that is that in the future there will be more Australians who will have been visiting this part of India at that time compared to south and the west and the north, where we do have a lot of people. Today we advertised a couple of Qantas flights that were going to be leaving next week out of Mumbai and Chennai, and they sold out very quickly, in less than half an hour. So there's a lot of demand, a lot of Australians in those parts of the country. So I hope you've been able to hear me. I think some of my audio might have been quite as good, but if there's anything you missed, please come back and ask me. But I'd like to now open it up for any further questions. Maybe I'll briefly touch on that question you asked earlier, Beck, about China. Look, I don't want to really harp on about China. China has been Australia's major trading partner, and I assume will continue to be a major trading partner for Australia. This is one of the things we're all going to have to work out: is how does this situation change trading relationships? I would note that China is now one of the countries that is moving more rapidly out of the virus and it's getting back to a level of normality. But I think, even before this started, the coronavirus situation, we were already, I think many Australian companies were looking to diversify. They realised that there was, some of them maybe were relying too much on China, and we felt that quite strongly during that early time when China was going into lockdown before the rest of the world. So, I think many businesses will think about, and they will naturally look to India, not just because India and China are the two big, most highly populated countries in the world, but because of a lot of other factors as well, because of the growing middle class in both countries and the diversification of interest in both those countries, the rapid growth in very many sectors, particularly in India. So this is what I was talking about earlier. India is a country that offers a lot of opportunities to Australia, and that's really what I'm on about. And that's why I'm here in Calcutta at this very exciting time. So that's it for me for now. I'll hand back to Vivek, who I think is sharing, and happy to take any questions. Can't hear you at the moment, Vivek.
Yeah. Also, no questions on cricket today.
No questions on cricket. I can happy to answer any cricket questions. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. The first question, Mr. Andrew, is from Professor R.C. Bhattacharya, who is the Vice Chairman of Globson Business School. In this pandemic period, there is a need for cross-border collaboration between friendly countries. What do you think can be done by both the countries in the area of education?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So in terms of the broader question of cross-border collaboration, one of the things has been that there has been a lot more collaboration in some ways than you might have seen in the past. So at the ministerial level, our prime ministers have already spoken a few times, our foreign minister, our trade ministers, and we've also seen the secretaries of our respective external affairs ministries talking on a regular basis. And a lot of that has been about immediate issues to do with how we tackle the coronavirus, but also about these long-term issues, like, because we do recognise that even though we're all locked down from each other and the extent of trade and people flows is severely reduced, that we do all want that to come back. And so I think education is, as I mentioned earlier, has been a flagship sector under our strategy for India, and I think it will continue to be so. I know I was speaking earlier today with our High Commissioner in Delhi, and he's been speaking to groups of Australian Vice Chancellors who are very interested in the Indian market, as they have been for some time, not just in the area of Indian students coming to study in Australia, which is important, but also in terms of joint collaborations, joint research. I've heard of a few examples of Australian and Indian research laboratories trying to look at how to tackle the pandemic itself, whether they can come up with vaccines and cures. So I think there was already great capacity in areas like engineering and in science, and I think we can only see this develop. Of course, we do need to get through this current period if it's going to involve people coming backwards and forwards between the countries, but at this stage, a lot of collaboration can certainly happen over through screens, through existing relationships, using technology. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'd like to see more. I've been getting around slowly to meet some of the universities in my patch, and I wanted to do more of that. I've had to put that on hold for now, but when I get back, there are people there who would like me to come and visit the university. Please get in contact, and we can look to do that once it's possible. But certainly, a face-to-face meeting, if that would help too, to try and link you up. Our Austrade, their job is to promote education links between our countries. They do a great job of that as well.
Thank you, sir. I'll go on to the next question. This is from Mr. Hemant Marda. He's asking if there are any changes that Australia is making for the tourism sector in the post-COVID situation or the post-COVID scenario.
I think I touched on that briefly in my talk. We are moving, the Minister for Trade, who also manages tourism, has emphasised that tourism is probably one of the sectors that'll take a bit longer to get going compared to other sectors, because of our international borders will probably remain, the restrictions on our borders will be one of the last restrictions to be lifted, I expect. So in terms of international tourism between our countries, that's going to take a little bit longer, and maybe will happen more on a controlled basis. So at this stage, a lot of the focus in Australia is to try and revive our domestic tourism. I think, as many of you will be aware, we had quite severe bushfires in Australia in December and January through to February, and then we had the COVID situation. So a lot of our popular tourism locations were impacted, had what we call a double whammy, where they had people who couldn't visit because of fires and now the health factors. So what stage one is really will be to try and get Australians to go and visit parts of Australia they haven't seen before, once they're able to. And then I think there's this possibility we talked about of Australia and New Zealand being some sort of bubble that's being talked about, where we can travel between there and New Zealand. And then I think, the phase then, the future would be where we can have international tourists go backwards and forwards again. And I'm sure we all want that. Just from a personal perspective, I'd love to go back and visit Australia sometime. I'm sure many of you would too. And I've been encouraging lots of people to visit Australia. So this is something we want. But I think it'll be interesting to see. I'm not a tourism expert, but tourism will be impacted. You know, it'll be interesting to see how cruise ships have been very important, have been very popular with the problems around cruise ships and COVID-19. There's sort of talk about how people will look for other forms of tourism. So I think tourism is one of those markets that is going to have to adapt the post-COVID environment.
Thank you, sir. I'm clubbing the next two questions. It is from Mr. V.K. Arora and Mr. Saha. So they want to know what kind of, what is the stage of Australia? If Australia is developing any vaccine or treatment, or is, is it close to any cure or testing or something? And the same related question is, they want some sharing of experience, as you are an easternmost country, but you and New Zealand have seemed to cross the hump much earlier than other countries on this virus scenario. So any best practices, any pearls of wisdom?
Yeah, look, in terms of vaccine, I think that's the million-dollar question, really, isn't it? Or maybe even billion-dollar question is, I know there's work going on in many places. I'm not aware of any new, any exciting development. I can tell you to say, yes, there's a vaccine about to come, but I'm reasonably optimistic. I do know that coronavirus itself the other coronaviruses are not easy to develop a vaccine for, but we have an unprecedented situation where there are scientists all over the world now who are collaborating and working to produce this vaccine because it is a global pandemic. And I think that puts us ahead of probably many other situations, many other pandemics which were maybe confined to particular parts of the world. This one being truly global, I think has meant that work has started. And I have heard a few examples where they're moving to human testing, including an interview I heard today with one of Australia's former Nobel Prize-winning scientists who was an expert in vaccines. He was surprisingly optimistic that we could even have a vaccine in the second half of this year, which would be great. So nothing concrete there to tell you except that it's hard, but I think with so many people working on it, our chances are better. And there's a lot of, Australia's CSIRO is one of those. In terms of Australia and New Zealand's experience, I think I sort of touched on a lot of the factors at the start, but I think if you look at the 6,900 cases, about two-thirds of those have come from people who've come into the country from overseas. So that's why I think these travel restrictions will stay in place for the longest, because the general view in Australia is that has been a major factor, and that includes early restrictions on travel in and out of the country, and then for those who are coming back into the country, having to quarantine in a hotel room. So it's pretty strict quarantining. You do have to stay in your room. You can't see anybody else when you're in that room, except the person you travelled with, who might be a member of your family. And then in terms of physical distancing, I do think there is a bit of advantage that Australia has, I guess, in terms of many parts of Australia, people are fortunate enough to have their own home, and they have been able to work from home. They have been able to order food from home and things like that. And the physical distancing has been pretty strictly followed. About only 2 people can meet in public. So a lot of my friends have said, they can only go out and meet one other person, and if they have to be their husband or wife, well, then they can't really go and meet anyone else at all. So it has been quite strict. There has been a strong emphasis on people being able to work from home. Even when they do come into the office, there's been strong protocols. All of these things exist in India. I think it's just much harder in India when there are so many people who live close to each other. So it is much harder to maintain that sort of distancing. And the one thing we know about this virus is that it does seem to be very contagious. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is get the factor under one. So that what that means is every case infects less than one person. So over time, what that means is the virus will die out. And that's one of the ways we've flattened the curve, is through physical distancing and through strict travel and quarantining. You'll feel a bit jealous of some of my Australian family members who can go for a run or a walk outside, but I think, again, maybe Australia's wide open spaces mean that they've been able to do that without having to, without it being following as much in terms of physical distancing. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, sure does. So the next question is there any plan to relocate the Office of Australian Business Houses to India from China that we could collaborate with or benefit from?
I'm not aware of any particular companies that are relocating at this stage, but I think you probably need to look beyond just having business houses here. I think these days, particularly even more now, I think with people using video conferencing, you'll probably see a lot more trade will be done in ways that are different in the past of just simply setting up an office. So, but in terms of, yes, I guess the real part of the question is, will there be companies moving from China to India? Look, I think there will be already, as I mentioned in my talk, many companies that will be looking to diversify to India. Some companies, some big Australian companies may have had experiences in India in the past that might have put them off. And so some of those might need convincing that that the past is past and the future is very different. So I think there's an opportunity, there's very much an opportunity there, and part of that will come down to those of us who are working to try and promote India in Australia. It will also come down to companies that come here having a good experience of working, trading, and investing in India.
These are just this last one or two questions. I'm combining these questions not because of time, but because they're of similar nature. This is from Mr. Himadri Mandal and again Shubhankar Saha. They want to know details of any financial packages or incentives being offered to exporters and industries from Australia and based in Australia. Yes, especially in food and agriculture processing.
So I did touch on a few of those in my talk, and maybe
yes,
you didn't hear about those, but one of them was the JobKeeper payment, which is allowing employers to not lay their workers off, but to keep them in place. And I was even just speaking to a very prominent Indian business person who's based in Kolkata, has offices in Australia, who said that payment was very important for his company to keep people employed in Australia. There's also this freight assistance mechanism, which is helping some key Australian agricultural and food exporters to honour their contracts, and that's resulted in seafood and beef and other premium products flying backwards and forwards. I also mentioned credit facility from our Export Finance Australia and some special facilities for our small and medium enterprises in Australia. So all of these things exist. If you weren't able to catch all of that because you couldn't hear me so well, maybe through MCCI you can make contact with me later, and I'm happy to send back some details via email.
Thank you, sir. And so do we have time for one last question?
One last question, that'll be fine.
Okay. So we want to understand, this is Mr. R.P. Ritolia. He wants to know what is the impact of COVID-19 on the coal mining sector in Australia. Mr. R.P. Ritolia needs no introduction. I hope you know you were on the you were in the meeting on the coal sector that day, so I could not ignore him.
Well, no, Mr. Ritolia and Mr. Aurora, who's already asked a question, are both very well known to me. And in fact, I've sat here and listened to them speak quite a few times and learned more from them than they may have learned from me today. But anyway, Mr. Ritolia, I think what I would say is Australian mining has continued on. Mining is one of the essential sectors in Australia, and I think you will see that, which includes coal mining. I think you will see that it'll be one of the sectors that helps lead Australia out of into recovery once we get through this current economic slowing that's been caused by having to lock down our economies. So yeah, I think coal mining will continue on, and I know that India is trying to move to greater self-sufficiency in thermal coal. I'm sure some thermal coal suppliers would like to be able to continue to supply India in the future, but certainly I expect in metallurgical coal that we will continue to be able to supply India's needs. And from the discussions that I've had or seen, it's still looking pretty positive for the mining sector.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Before I hand over to my Vice President, Rishabh Kothari, for the vote of thanks, I would personally want to thank you. You know, I hope now you are convinced that having a session back to back, you know, one in March and one in May was not such a bad idea, because I go back with a lot of new information and some food for thought. And I hope the other participants have enjoyed. I've seen some of the comments. Some of them have enjoyed it. And so once again, thank you on behalf of myself and the entire Merchant Chamber of Commerce Industry family. Over to you, Rishabh. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. And it is my privilege and honor to propose this vote of thanks. It was extremely engaging discussion on how Australia is tackling the coronavirus and what will be the likely impact on its relation with its trade partners. I want to wholeheartedly thank our guest, Mr. Andrew Ford, Consul General of Australia in Kolkata, for gracing this webinar and enriching all of us through his valuable insights and views. I also want to express my heartfelt thanks to members of the Chamber, friends, business associates, and all the participants for their august presence in this webinar. I believe with initiatives like this, we can find solutions to many problems which the world is facing today due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and strengthen our relations with the rest of the world in terms of bilateral trade as well as human-to-human relationships. With these few words, I propose a hearty vote of thanks and request you all to carry this with acclamation. Thank you.
I would just like to add thanks to our friends from the media, whoever they are, and if they're not there and they're getting the press release, thank you for giving us your coverage. Thank you, Rishabh.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you. Yes, so do I. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir.